very happy to be with you today. I'm also a bit scared because I'm going to talk about PHP. PHP, this weird web language that you probably learn to hate so much. So, as Sylvain said, I'm an entrepreneur who loves open source, and I happen to write code in PHP. I'm a huge contributor on GitHub. I'm in the top 5 most active user on GitHub, mainly contributing to PHP projects like Twig, which is a templating system for PHP, Silex, which is a micro framework for PHP, and Symfony, which is a set of components for PHP and also a full stack framework. So when it comes to PHP, I know what I'm talking about. But today I'm not going to show you much PHP code on the slides. Instead, I want to talk about the current state of PHP. And I think that PHP is at a turning point in its life. So the question is, what can we do, what can I do to make PHP still relevant for the next decade? And can it become hype again? It's happening in JavaScript, so why not? I'm going to be very honest about PHP today. Personally, I have a hate-love relationship with PHP. Like, many developers, I've been a PHP developer for the last 10 years or so, and yet I don't like PHP. I think I'm not the only one, and I think people hate PHP as a language, right? But PHP got something right, and that's the platform. And I think that many people like PHP as a platform. So I don't like PHP as a language. I like it mostly as a platform. So PHP was created a very long time ago by Rasmus Lerdorf, and the version we are using on a day-to-day basis nowadays is based on a work from Andy Gutmans and Ziv Zurowski, which means that there are no dictator for PHP, and that's a big problem in my book. So for a very long time, adding new features in PHP, it was a very weird process with no discussion at all. So if some core PHP developer has a need, it just committed something to the repository directly, and also because PHP has no specifications. So that's probably why PHP is so inconsistent and surprising at times. Fortunately, things are getting better. Things are getting fixed. And PHP now has a much better process for accepting changes to the language itself with an RFC process. It also has a very well-defined release policy. So those changes led to a lot of great features that that people added along the years, the last 2 or 3 years, like real anonymous functions, generators, traits, and even coroutines. So all those features were discussed a lot on the mailing list before being accepted into the core, and that's a great change, really. But PHP also evolved because of userland changes. With Composer, Composer is a dependency manager for PHP, so thanks to Composer, thanks to more discussion between developers of big projects, now people start reusing code from one project to the next one. So one great example of that is that the next version of Drupal is going to use some of the Symfony components, and I think that's a big deal. So even if PHP still has some problems, I think that everyone is working really hard to fix all those issues, the community, the processes, the tools, everything really. And of course, I also think that PHP got some of the things right from the get-go. I think that having one data structure to rule them all arrays in PHP was a great idea. Of course, it has some weird behaviors at times, but I think it was really a good idea for newcomers and the learning curve for PHP. So that's PHP as a language. I think it's getting better, and things are being fixed with time. And I think people like PHP as a platform probably because PHP was created specifically for the web. This is one of the only language that was specifically created for the web. So if you have no prior knowledge of PHP or the web, you can kind of really easily create your first website. And that's also because there is a great documentation website for PHP, and it's also very easy to install, easy to configure, and easy to host. So that's a great platform. And as a matter of fact, PHP is the most popular server-side language for the web. According to W3Techs, it owns 80% of the web. That's a huge number, and okay, it's probably not accurate, but even if we are talking about, let's say, 40% of the web, that's still a huge number. So we have a clear winner here. PHP is massive, like no other technologies on the server side. More interesting is that if you have a look at the biggest open source platform, the biggest platforms on the web, you can see that WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, Magento, Typo3, all those software are written in PHP. That says something about PHP itself. So WordPress is powering about 20% of the web, and I think that the success here is not the language, it's the platform. People love WordPress not because it's written in PHP, but because the way PHP works, the way it's so easy to contribute something, so there are hundreds, thousands of modules for WordPress. And to me, the most important PHP asset is the way it works. Right? So this is a typical architecture for installing PHP. You have a web server, Apache, Nginx, whatever. Then you have PHP FPM, which manages a set of PHP processes. So this is a typical share-nothing architecture, but as we'll see in a minute, pushed to the limits. So here you can see a typical life cycle of several requests. So you have the PHP process. PHP itself is about a bunch of modules. So each time you create a new PHP process, there is all the module initialization. That's the blue box at the top. And then you have the shutdown at the end when PHP FPM is going to recycle the PHP process. And then every time there is a request, we initialize the request, we run some PHP script, and then we shut down everything. And our shutdown, the request shutdown, is really about, traces everything about the current request. Everything you've done during the request is just discarded. Right? So you need to do the same things over and over again. And because of this request shutdown, PHP is very stable. It does not leak memory from one request to the next one, and it does not crash. But during the last few years, PHP evolved a lot, as I said before, and the ecosystem also evolved a lot. So people are now using PHP in a very different way than the old simple script that you had 10 or 15 years ago. So now we have frameworks, we have ORMs, we have dependency injection containers, we have object-oriented programming everywhere, class autoloading, and much more. And all those things are really nice if you are talking about scaling your team, if you want to scale your developers. But it comes at a price, performance. And PHP was never optimized for this kind of use cases, which means that those applications are really slow. And of course, whenever there is a new PHP version coming out, it is much better than the previous one. The performance is much better, typically anywhere between 5 and 10%. And the same goes for memory consumption, but we are still talking about small performance improvements. There's also a great initiative by Facebook. They created HHVM, which is really a new implementation of PHP. That's very difficult because PHP, again, has no specifications. But they are working really hard. So this is a C++ implementation of PHP. with modern compilation techniques, with just-in-time compiler. And that speeds up a lot all those heavy apps. This is also very exciting because Facebook invests a lot of money to be sure that all our applications work equally well on PHP and HHVM. So I think that's probably something that can make PHP hype again. We'll see. So anyway, those improvements are nice, but I'm looking at speeding up PHP much more than just 10 or 15%. I want to improve the performance of PHP by a factor of 10 or 20 perhaps. So to be able to achieve that, let's have a deeper look at how typical PHP request actually works. So when PHP executes your script, when you're using a framework like Symfony, we have a fat bootstrap phase where we load a lot of files, we create a lot of objects, then we execute the request logic, and then we clean up. And the request shutdown kills everything. So it kills performance, really, because at the very end of the request, it trashes everything, even the things that we could have reused from one request to the next one. That's why modern PHP apps are really slow. So the challenge is to avoid trashing things that can be reused from one request to the next one, things that do not really depend on the request. And by doing that, it should be possible to speed up PHP apps by a factor of 20. So how is it possible? Conceptually, if we could do the bootstrapping during the module init phase, so this one is executed just once when we create a PHP process, and we move there everything that do not depend on the request, then it could be really useful. But of course, we can't do that because PHP does not allow us to hook into those events. But conceptually, that's what I want to do. And that's also how many other languages work. So we need to figure out a way to actually simulate that in plain PHP. So what we need is an application server, probably written in PHP. There are many challenges. I'm not going to talk about all the challenges here today, but the first one is how we control global states, right? Because we assume that PHP is going to trash everything at the end of the request. A lot of applications assume that you are dealing with just one request. So you have global states that depend on the request, and that's really bad. And PHP itself assumes that, right? There is one request per request cycle. So there is a bunch of global variables. So you can't deal with more than one request per request cycle, really. And that's why in Symfony we have this nice object, the request object, so you can create a request from the global variables, but you can also create a request from anything. So it's possible to deal with more than one request within one PHP request cycle. The same goes for the response. PHP assumes that you are going to deal with one response, and whenever you echo something into the standard output, it means that you are outputting something for the current request, which is kind of bad. And again, of course, Symfony has a nice response object to abstract that. That's the first challenge. The second one is how you can handle several requests, HTTP requests, within one PHP request cycle. Because, of course, PHP is doing a lot of stuff during the request initiation and the request shutdown. So in Symfony, we have abstracted that into an HTTP kernel interface. I'm not going to talk too much about that. But it's kind of, a process with a bunch of events you can hook into to be able to handle a request, and you can also make sub-requests, which means that you can handle more than one request per PHP request cycle. So that's kind of, Symfony is also kind of a middleware for PHP application, a bit like what you had in Ruby with Rack or WSGI for Python. It's not exactly the same, but it's about standardizing the HTTP protocol and the way we actually interact with it. So this is the next challenge. So for instance, this is some snippets of code from PHP source code. So for instance, during the request initialization, PHP start a session, Of course, we can do that from userland. That's not a big deal. It cleans up everything at the end, like rolling back transactions and stuff like that. And all those things, we can do the same from PHP, so we can simulate what PHP does in PHP directly. And then there are also some things that we do not want PHP to do, like cleaning the auto-loading functions, for instance. We want to keep that from one request to the next one. So the fact that we are bypassing all those events is kind of nice. The next challenge is about memory leaks. Of course, as we are going to handle more than one request, and PHP is not really optimized for that use case, we are going to have memory leaks. And during the last 2 or 3 years, I worked really hard to optimize Symfony so that the core components of Symfony, they do not leak memory or not too much. So based on those facts, I think it's really possible to create an application server for PHP. And actually, there are some proof of concepts that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So the first one is PHP PM. It's written entirely in PHP based on React PHP. React PHP is the equivalent of what Node.js is for JavaScript, because it shows you that with this application server written in plain PHP with Nginx on top of that, you can get 15 times improvement for a typical really fat Symfony application, 15 times faster with PHP PM and Nginx instead of plain Nginx and PHP FPM. And so when I started to work on Symfony 4 or 5 years ago, I was really conscious about this problem, and that's why I really worked on optimizing everything in Symfony so that we can actually create this kind of application server. So as you might have guessed, I'm also working on such an application server. I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's written in Go with a small amount of PHP for the glue, and I get kind of the same numbers that I've talked about with PHP PM, anywhere between 15 and 20%, 20 times faster than regular PHP PM and Nginx. Today I wanted to share my thought about PHP and how we can make it better. I like PHP as a platform. I think that HHVM, Composer, RFCs, and all those nice stuff, and some other initiatives can save PHP from becoming the next COBOL or something. And who knows, PHP can be hyped again soon. Thank you.